This is How to Build a Ministry You Love. And I'm Pastor Kathleen Panning. Thank you all for being here. We've had a few technical things, so that's why we're starting a few minutes late, but it's wonderful to have you here. And I want to let you know a little bit about who I am and why I'm doing this. Um, I said I'm Pastor Kathleen Panning, but I've been in ministry in various forms for 42 years now, and I've seen ministry in generally change, and my ministry has changed a whole lot. In that time, I have served two small rural congregations. I've been on the staff of a 6,000 member congregation, and I've been in a team ministry with my husband for 13 years, and a clergy spouse relationship, and that's a whole different ballgame too. And that was in a very large rural congregation, semi suburban type. And all of those, each of those places had their own unique things. And I've done CPE and a bunch of other continuing education. But in the process, I've always struggled to find what is ministry for me? Where do I fit? What, how do I work into the structures that are there? How do I kind of turn things and be me in the midst of a congregation or a situation that's got its own traditions and it's got its own way of doing things and kind of expects me to conform to all of that as well. And it's been a struggle. And it's been a struggle to find how God made me and how that fits in with ministry. And that's been a long journey. And that's why I'm doing this workshop, so that maybe you don't have to wait 42 years, hopefully, to get to the point where I am right now. And yes, I've retired from parish ministry, but this is a new kind of ministry. And there are many new forms and shapes of ministry that are possible out there these days because of technology like this, and because ministry and life itself is changing. And that means we have to be able to envision ministry in new ways, and that gives us the opportunity to drive, to be a part of a ministry that we really love, and to do it as faithful women and maybe men too, if there's any men on this, to do that in a way that's in line with who God made us to be, but also in line with the ministry. So that's why I'm doing this. And part of this, I want to share with you my story. And that's different from what I just shared. You know, most of the times when we introduce ourselves, we do the kind of like, this is my name, this is where I'm a pastor, this is what I'm doing, and those kinds of things. Or if you're in a business relationship, it's, this is my job title, this is the number of years I've been in that job, these are the credentials. And that's fine. It has its place. And it's a good thing. But it's not really our story. And probably about a year ago, I started learning to tell my story in a whole different way. And it was a little bit scary at first, because I was starting to share a part of my story that I had not shared before. It was something that was a difficult time in my ministry. I had been approximately 5 years into my second position, which was in that very large congregation of 6,000 members, and I was one of the pastors on staff. And I was doing my work, and I had just gone through a period of 3.5 months where I was averaging a funeral every single week. So that was 14 funerals in 3.5 months. And I know some of you understand how that has draining that can be. And there was a little bit of a break in there, and hadn't had a funeral for a couple of weeks. And the new senior pastor asked me to come to his office on a Friday afternoon. And we had a little bit of conversation, and then he said he was giving me the opportunity to choose. Okay, what were my choices? I had two choices: resign or be fired. Those were not the kind of choices that I wanted. Those were choices that really kicked me in my gut. I was devastated. I thought of myself as an utter failure. I really was on the verge of quitting ministry altogether. That, to me, meant it was like flunking ministry as far as I was concerned. And I didn't flunk stuff. I was the kind of kid who in school, if I got anything less than a B, that was a bad grade on any test or anything like that. So to be told that my services were no longer needed, no longer wanted at that congregation, that was a really tough blow. And my self-esteem was shaken. Any and every time I'd ever thought of myself as not good enough came roaring back, and it was top of mind. And so it took me a good while to work through that, but I never shared that part of my story. I was ashamed of it. I was embarrassed, and I really didn't want other people to know that I had failed, or what I thought had failed. But the other part of me realized that as I look back with even a couple of months of a perspective on that, I realized that that place, I was glad I had been there to experience and do what I could at that congregation. I learned a lot. There were good things that happened, many good people I met, many good things. But I began to realize that that was not a place for me. I really didn't fit in what was more of a corporate atmosphere in ministry, that was not the kind of person I am. And it was really keeping me inside of a box of, you got to get permission to do everything. You got to do just these things, and all of the rest of it was, no, that wasn't something I was supposed to be interested in, wasn't where I was supposed to go. Those weren't the kinds of ideas or possible new ventures to get involved in, or even to bring to the table. And so that place in ministry would have been, if I had stayed there for any length of time, that could have been really narrowing me and making me even smaller than I was feeling at that time, which was pretty darn small, to be very honest with you. But what I found after that is I began to explore other ideas, other avenues that were not just the typical kinds of continuing education or learning opportunities that most of us in ministry, or at least in my denomination, would typically do. For instance, one of the things I did after working with mentors and things, I went on to become the very first pastor, religious leader of any faith to be certified in a particular counseling mentoring methodology called the option process method, and using the option process dialogue, to be the very first one in the whole world. And I have not kept up that certification, but I still know that process. And I still use what I've learned from there very, very much, because it has formed me and shaped me in new ways. And I've taken the training to be a Fascinate certified advisor. And you may be familiar with things like Myers-Briggs or DISC, those personality assessments. Well, this is a very different kind of personality assessment that tells us how people perceive us. It's the outside-in perspective. Instead of how we think of and see the world, it's how the world sees us. And again, I've been the very first pastor to become a Fascinate certified advisor. And I also went on to do some other things. I've designed the floor plan for the house that we live in. I've mentored 14 seminary students, most of them through 2 years of their seminary training. And that was a real blessing to be able to work with them and do that as I served in ministry. And since retiring, I've started my own business, and for 4.5 years now, I've been hosting a live internet radio show that has reached people on every single continent except Antarctica. That's the one thing I got to say, that not very many people down there. A lot of penguins, but I don't think they listen to the radio, so or have internet access. But every single continent, and just blows my mind of things that I've been able to do, and I would never have been able to say, hey, these are the things I've done, before I learned how to tell my story and realized the blessings that have come since I left that congregation. Now, mind you, I would rather have left in a different way and on my terms, yes, but understanding that leaving when I did was really important. And I can look back and say that was God's timing, even though in many aspects it looks to the world like failure. So telling my story in this way is all about telling not only the good stuff, but the bad and even ugly stuff that many times we just don't want to share because it's painful. And sometimes we feel ashamed, and the world looks at those things and says, oh boy, that person isn't a good person, or that those are difficult things for whatever reason. And that is how all of us need to learn to tell our story. And it's not only about what God has done and giving God the glory. Yes, I give God the glory for all of that. But it's also realizing what God has done through us and taking and realizing that as well. As I have read through Scripture, some of the giants of Scripture, Moses and David and the disciples, they gave God a lot of glory. But they also talked about what they did and their work and how they have gone forward. And that's what we need to do too. People need to hear us as human beings, the full story, the whole story. And that's what makes each of us unique. How God has worked through us, where God is leading us, and the wins that we've had along the way. Every one of those things that I listed about creating the floor plan for the house, the seminary students I've mentored, becoming the first religious leader certified for a couple of things, all of those are wins. But I would never have thought of them that way until I learned how to tell my story. And learning how to tell my story also helped me to stop thinking small. It has encouraged me to broaden my perspective of what happens, who I am, and how I work. It's small thinking. I never realized when I was in ministry that I was thinking small in many, many ways. I was limiting myself to the traditional way that ministry was being done in my denomination, in my faith group, which is Christian. Denomination is Lutheran. But I was limiting my thinking and way of doing things, kind of putting blinders on myself to what I had been taught in ministry, what I saw from other people, the faith leaders, the pastors I had experienced growing up. Of course, they were all males, so that was a little bit of a difficulty with that. But I had blinders on to other possibilities that God could open my eyes to. And so small thinking is looking at things the way they've always been. Small thinking is limiting the vision to what I already know and what I've been imagining up to this point in my life. Small thinking is limiting my vision to what I think might be possible and not opening to other ideas, not being open to hearing from other people, not looking around me and taking in things outside of my faith and seeing what might be out there that can be useful, that can be helpful in sharing the message. Kind of like this technology now. When I started ministry, number one, the internet did not exist. I'm that old, yes. But number one, the internet did not exist at all. And I can remember my first parish when I got my first computer. It was one of those great big video things that's heavy. It took up about the size of this table here, and they were heavy, bulky kinds of things. And I did word processing on it, and that was about it. But it was sure better than a typewriter for doing my sermons, because I didn't have to draw arrows all over the place. I could move things around. But I never dreamed at that point that what was beginning to happen, even with something like a simple computer, which today is, I have my phone sitting out here, and this gadget has more computing technology in it today than Apollo 13 had in it. Never dreamed that could be possible. So, yes, there are things we don't know, and that limits our vision, but we have to be able to pull that out. And sometimes we have an inkling, we have a dream, we have a possibility, but because we don't understand where it might be going, we put it on the shelf. I did that. I did that when I was in 8th grade. That's the time I started feeling a nudging, a tugging from God to do something in ministry, in the life of the church. And so I looked around at all the possibilities for women. I saw being a secretary. I saw doing the Christian education. I saw, and I could work in music, help in the kitchen, most definitely. And I had a great aunt who had been a missionary for a year in India, and I don't know exactly what she did, but I'm sure it was teaching other women, because that was in like the 1920s, and that would have been the only possibility then. And I had another great aunt who was a Lutheran deaconess, and that was for single women who were committing their life to service. And she had worked as an administrator in what was then called an orphanage and an old folks home. And I met both of these women, and the one who was a deaconess, I knew for about the first 13 years of my life, and off and on contact with her and with other women in that kind of ministry too, most of whom were did things like working in what we would call now a retirement community or nursing home, or in a hospital setting as a nurse or some administrative position. And I looked at all those things and all the people I knew, the women I knew who did those, and I said, that's good, that's wonderful, but it doesn't fit me. It did not fit where I was feeling tugged to go. And there was nothing there. So I put that feeling, that dream, that possibility on a shelf. And it stayed there for years, all through high school. And it was there when I started college. I went to a Christian college, one associated with the Lutheran Church. And within the first week or so of college, as a freshman, got one of those packages of things that, all of the goodies that they give freshmen, forms and ideas and, the catalog and all of those kinds of things that freshmen get. And part of what was in that packet was a card from the campus pastor's office asking about religious preferences, just so they would know who we are and what we might be interested in and how to serve the students. And the request was to fill out the card and return it to the campus pastor's office. Well, I was a dutiful little freshman, and I filled out the card and I trotted it in to the campus pastor's office, to the secretary, and was ready to go out the door and got invited to go in and talk to the campus pastor. Okay. And he, asked the typical kinds of questions. Who am I? Where am I from? My family? What am I thinking about majoring in? Quite honestly, I didn't have a clue. I really did not know. And so I had gone through the catalog and knew kind of what they offered, and I started with A and was working my way through the alphabet. And when I got to R, I said religion. And he looked at me and he said, had I ever thought about becoming a pastor? I looked at this wonderful man, probably with an expression of being completely dumbfounded. And I didn't even know women could go to seminary at that point in time. And I asked, can women do that? Because nobody told me that that was a possibility. And it turned out that about 12 months before I started college, the Lutheran church that I was part of and the one that the college was part of had both voted to allow women to become pastors. And one woman had been ordained about sometime the summer before I started college, like a year before. And another one had been ordained about 10 months before I started college. When I found that out, and the campus pastor told me that, what I had put on the shelf all of a sudden came down, because it was like, oh, that's what that's about. That's what that nudging is about. That's the idea that God had planted, that seed that was there, as we sometimes call it. And it was basically in my mind a given from that point on that that was the road that I'd be traveling. I did take a slight detour at one point. I thought about becoming a vet's assistant. I love animals, and I'd always wanted a dog as a kid. That would never happened as a kid, but anyway, I had always wanted a dog, and I loved animals. And I spent a January term working as a vet's assistant locally there, and found out that probably wasn't a good idea because I was very allergic to cats. So it just, God chooses and shows us the directions at sometimes. So it was, basically, when I heard about women can become pastors, it was, Oh, and sometimes that's what it takes to get those dreams that we have. Sometimes we have to wait, yes, but sometimes it's about planning and starting to put some things in motion. And too often, as women, for those of you who are women watching this and being part of this, too often as women, culturally, we are taught to put ourselves last. You know, family comes first. If your ministry comes first. Everything and everyone comes before us. And we take care of everyone else's wishes, we take care of everyone else's dreams and everyone else's expectations. And we visit all of the people in the congregation, we take care of all of them. And then we get whatever's left over. And sometimes that's crumbs. Sometimes there's not much of anything left over. And so we have to learn to do things to nurture ourselves, to nurture those dreams, to help expand that vision so that we stop thinking small. That's what we have to do with all of those kinds of things. So we need to stop thinking that the only way of doing something is the way we've always been taught. That the only way of doing things is, how we've been thinking about them. What we need, what we're thinking, what we're dreaming, and the way things have been in the past. And when that's the only model we look at, we're putting ourselves, we're putting our ministry, and we're even putting God in a box. Tell you a quick little story. I did a children's sermon a number of years ago and got a great big cardboard box from, it had like a dishwasher or something in it, and it was empty, and I kind of deconstructed it and put it back together using Velcro strips so that I could take it apart during the children's sermon. And I had in there all kinds of objects that represented how we think about God. A crown for God as king, a gavel for God as judge, all kinds of different things. And I took these out one by one, and this children's sermon became the main sermon. It was a very visual sermon for the congregation. And I took these items out one by one and talked about them and said, well, this is how we think about God, and this is how we think about God, and this is how we think about God. And in the end, I said, and sometimes we think about God as contained. God is how we understand God, and that's like putting God in a box. And God is how we as a congregation understand God, and that's like, keeping God confined to the building that we were in. And in the end, I said, God's too big for any box, for any building. And so I ripped open the Velcro strips and no longer had a box there. And that's what we need to do as we begin to vision things, as we begin to think about, what are we doing? Where are we going? What are those dreams that we've had for ourselves? What are the dreams and visions that we have for ministry? What is it, those nudges that maybe we haven't been listening to, or that we put on the shelf? They may be so buried up there that we've even forgotten them. Where are they? What are they? And what do we have to stop doing in order to hear them? Sometimes, many times, There are things that get in our way, things that things that things that we really need to stop, things that we really need to think about. Is this useful anymore? Is this, is this the way I've been moving, the things I've been doing, the way I've been sharing things? Is this really useful? And sometimes it's things that we tolerate about ourselves. Sometimes it's things that we tolerate about the congregation or where we're serving. Sometimes it's things that we tolerate in the way ministry goes. And what I want you to do is think about, what are the things that you're tolerating? What are those ways that might be getting in your way? The things that are burying your dreams that are on the shelf. The things that are the expectations that you have or that others have that might be blocking where God is leading you, where you're feeling a nudge to go. I don't know about you, but there are times where I've found myself, hey, I'd like to learn more about that, about something that's kind of outside the norm. I'd like to learn. One of the things I've learned about is, and I'll tell more about this later, but thinking about the future possibilities, what's coming down the pike, the people who are envisioning things for the future. And that never fit in with ministry. Nobody ever said we should start doing that. Although I did at one point get to hear Alvin Toffler, who's done some work with future and futurology, the study of the future. And, that is so important. But most of my colleagues, most of the places where I've been in ministry, they haven't said that's a good thing. They haven't said that, we should pay attention to that. They're more focused on other things. And we'll talk about that as we go along too. But what is it that you need to stop tolerating? What do you need to stop doing along the way? And we're going to take a 15-minute break here. And I want you to think about that, to make a list of that for yourself. Try and write out 10 things that I need to stop doing X. And what are some of those things? What are some of those things? For me, one of them is I need to get rid of some of the clutter in my house in places, or stop hanging on to things I no longer need. We all do that in some way, but what is it that you need to stop doing? Some of the things you're tolerating. So we're going to take about a 15-minute break here, and as you're doing that, write out those things. Try to get at least 10 on your list of things to stop doing so that you can start thinking bigger. So just take it easy, take your break, and we'll be right back in about 15 minutes. So take care.